Hi, my name's Andy Holden. I'm an artist speaking to you from my studio in Bedford. I make installations, animations, sculpture, music, paintings, all sorts of things. Recently, I did a project which was a collaboration with my father called Natural Selection with Art Angel. And it was a work of exploring how birds make birds' nests and a history of egg collecting. I also made a film called Laws of Motion in a Cartoon Landscape, which is an hour-long animation, which the loose premise is that the world has become a cartoon or is best understood as a cartoon. And therefore, to understand how the world works now, we should look at how physics and logic works within the space of the cartoon. And it's a kind of examination of the golden age of animation. Prior to that, I made a very large textile knitted work for Tate Britain called Pyramid Piece and the Return of the Pyramid Piece, which was a large knitted scaled up replica of a piece of rock that I'd stolen from the Great Pyramid of Giza when I was a kid. And there's a film of me going to put the rock back 15 years later from the space that I'd taken it from. So I think those three works give you a little indication of what my work in general is about.
Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's talk. My name is Priyash Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Contemporary Projects at the National Gallery, and I'm thrilled that you have joined us today for the next in our series of the Unexpected View programme, where we explore some of the themes and ideas that are shared between a National Gallery painting and the practice of a significant artist working today. I hope that you are as excited as I am for this evening's talk with Andy Holden. But before we begin, I would like to thank Hiscox for the support of this programme as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner. This evening, Andy will be presenting in response to the self-portrait of the 17th century Sevillian painter, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, one of the most iconic and enigmatic of self-portraits that we have at the National Gallery and in our collection. Some of you may remember a wonderful exhibition focusing on Murillo's self-portraits in 2018, where the National Gallery's painting was paired with an earlier self-portrait by the artist from the Frick collection in New York. There is a lot of brilliant content online, including a fantastic talk on our YouTube channel from my colleague Letizia Treves that expands on much of the art historical subjects around the work. And instead today, we will look to draw out some of these ideas in the self-portrait through Andy's own interests and the themes that he explores in his own practice. Andy Holden is an artist based in Bedford whose work spans a number of varied forms, including sculpture, large installations, painting, performance, and multi-screen videos. The starting point for much of his work is an anecdote or a personal encounter. And these moments are then unpacked and expanded to explore broader philosophical questions and thoughts. I've been a huge fan of Andy's practice for a number of years now, in particular, the joyous journey that Andy takes us on through the narratives of his films and in his expanded installations, especially with recent works that have appropriated the world of cartoons as an allegorical method to understanding our contemporary landscape and the society that we inhabit. Andy's work is held in prestigious collections across the UK, including at Tate and the Arts Council, and he has presented in numerous exhibitions internationally and, of course, across the UK in recent years. I don't think I've got time to list them all here now, but I was fortunate to see his work last year in that brief reprieve of our lockdowns in a fantastic installation at Block 336 in Brixton, which I hope is a project that we'll be able to discuss today. Andy also performs regularly with his band, the Grubby Mitts, and runs a fantastic project space called Ex Baldassari in Bedford. So I hope we get to also talk about those projects as well. Now, as you can see, we are deviating slightly from our usual format by having this conversation online on Zoom rather than in the gallery in person. But we are using this format to our advantage this evening. So usually I would begin the conversation by asking Andy how he came to select this painting for our discussion. However, we are in for a particular treat today as Andy has produced a film. in the manner of his lecture performances to respond to this question. So I'll pass it over to Andy to introduce the film, which is about 20 minutes long, after which we will take questions from everyone. So do post your questions and comments in the Q&A box below as you're watching and enjoying the film. So without further ado, over to you, Andy.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Priyesh. I've made a sort of animated lecture for you to answer Priyesh's question about why Murillo's self-portrait. So I won't say much now because a cartoon version of me will tell you everything you need to know. In a way, I'd say this is probably sort of a chapter that I could have written as part of Laws of Motion in a cartoon landscape, I think. So we'll kind of consider it a kind of bonus or extra chapter to that film, which perhaps we can talk about afterwards. So enjoy the tour in and out of Murillo's self-portrait.
In Murillo's self-portrait, we see the artist in the frame, a clever use of a mirror, and a composition that we could say is a picture about a picture, or a meta-picture. What is a meta-picture? It is the self-staging of a painting in a painting, or a painting that stages its own fictiveness. A meta-picture puts on view its own maker or making. It is an image within an image, a mise en abîme. If a painting should strive for pictorial vision, a meta-painting reminds us of the conditions of its own making in order to disrupt such a vision. Suspension of disbelief is traditionally considered a hallmark of a successful painting. A meta-painting allows no such absorption. It is a moment of looking down. It is a painting aware of its own situation, self-staging its own illusion. We can see it here explained at the expense of Wile E. Coyote. Metapainting emerges at times of acute reflection on art and the conditions involved in its making, at times of frenetic evolution and artistic crisis. It is the probing of the tools we use to understand the images of our time. It comes and goes through art history. At times it is needed, at other times it is not. It was needed at the moment in art in which Murillo took to the stage, and it was needed again in the 1920s when the cartoon came along, and in the moment of our own immersion in the new world of spiralling digital images, unhooked from any material support, it is needed again. Let's start with the shadow out of which Murillo emerged. Murillo was from Seville in Spain. It is therefore hard to talk about Murillo without recourse to mention his esteemed Sevillian predecessor Velázquez. Many words have been written about Las Meninas and its fabulous and fascinating self-referential labyrinth of reflections, on the relation between the painting, which we see from the reverse with the artist gazing out from behind it, the models in the room, and the proposed beholder of the painting, reflected in the mirror at the far end of the room. Together these slippages create a complex cycle of substitutions and exchanges which never resolve. The artist is within the frame, but the subject is not the artist, but the act of painting itself. The digital image you are looking at was taken by me 2 years ago in the Prado, before I realised you were not allowed to take photos. It was the writer Michel Foucault who turned Las Meninas into a meta-picture. He told us to forget who was in the frame, to pretend not to know, undo the proper names, forego the adequate language of the anecdote, and confine ourselves to the grey, anonymous language, so that the painting may release its illuminations. The painting for Foucault is finally a representation of classical representation, and the definition of space that it opens up. It can, because of the absence of a subject, offer itself as a representation in a pure form. Foucault takes this line of investigation onto Magritte's "This is not a pipe," which takes up the tradition that a painting is nothing other than itself. This is not a pipe, but a painting of a pipe. This sentence is also not a pipe. However, he could equally have applied his theories to Chuck Jones's masterpiece from 1953, Duck Amuck. As artist Ollie Duke notes in his essay From Parrhesius to Harambe, the picture's frame is repeatedly transgressed as the animator's hand appears from what should be the realm of the viewer and into the cartoon, placing his paintbrush on the apparent surface and painting in the background. That was an illusion titled The Real Thing by Matt Pritchard. So let's let Murillo now enter stage left. Once again, it's a mirror trick, and the mirror is a space of potential deception. We can read Murillo's self-portrait as a mirror. Certainly a painting made with the use of a mirror. It reads as a mirror, as the background is painted to feel like a reflection of the wall opposite, although it could be the wall in front of us. And it leans rather than is hung. The mirror is often lurking at the back of classical painting, like in Las Meninas or the Arnolfini Marriage, offering us a different viewpoint from within the space of the painting, one that is included to confuse the position of the viewer. The self-portrait directly in a mirror is a different tradition. Can Murillo have ever seen Parmigianino's self-portrait in a convex mirror? Maybe he read about it in Vasari's Lives of the Artists. I'll let you into a secret. I had never seen this painting till just now when I searched it. Although I knew it well, I only knew its reflection through the ekphrasis of John Ashbery's poem, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. I never thought to look at it directly. John Ashbery writes in his poem that describes the painting, "In that gaze combination of tenderness, amusement and regret, so powerful in its restraint that one cannot look for long. The secret is too plain. The pity of its smarts make hot tears spurt, that the soul is not a soul, has no secret, is small and it fits, it's hollow perfectly, its room our moment of attention." That is the tune, but there are no words. The words are only speculation. From the Latin speculum, mirror. They seek and cannot find the meaning in the music. Ashbery goes on to write, "One would like to stick one's hand out of the globe, but its dimension, what carries it, will not allow it." 150 years later, Murillo does just that, sticking his hand out of the globe. So we see a mirror, and of course the frame that holds it, and a hand that holds that frame. It is the frame that is important here. All frames exist to offer interpretation. The frame tells us to only consider what is inside it, to separate what is inside the space of representation from the world beyond. A frame works to demarcate the image, to say what is inside the picture and what is outside. It is usually a physical thing, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a cognitive frame, the reasoning and logic embodied in our own thinking, which allows us to understand what we see based on previous experience. Or it can be an interpretive one, which creates a context for the image to be understood as within. The frame itself, as a physical support, is a non-place perhaps. It's not quite either. The same could be said of a mirror in a way, its content being dependent on whatever is offered up for reflection. In Las Meninas, it's the patron, the king and queen. Like Foucault, after a while it's easier to just name them. But Murillo depicts himself reflected, almost. Like Las Meninas, we again question where the spectator is in this. If this is a mirror reflecting Murillo back, where are we? We are in his position, left behind in the real world as he exits the world for the world of representations. His paints are discarded to the side of the mirror, suggesting he's only just left the room. The splashes of pure colour still fresh on the palette feel like this painting could hang right next to Philip Guston's The Studio. And when the gallery was quiet, the two artists would lean out of their frames and talk together about the history of art long into the night. Sooner or later, talk would turn to painting about painting and why it returns at a moment of crisis, when art, as we know it, is about to change. We are at one of those moments again. Images are unhooked from frames simultaneously everywhere at once, being reframed at a speed in which context can be constantly reinvented. We have arrived at a point in time in which purely digital images can be authenticated by blockchain and sold. Again, it is time to investigate the conditions of the image. It's no surprise that many of the early NFTs are meta pictures. Murillo provides a frame within a frame. He paints the non-place of the frame, and leaning forward out of the mirror, he places his hand directly upon it. He comes out of the frame, well, one of them. He's still well and truly in the picture. Inside the frame is the space of representation. Outside is the space of life. Murillo's hand is in the liminal space between the two, a border between the space of imitation and the space of the imitator. He painted this in Middle Age. He's on the threshold, between the world he inhabits and the world he depicts. His hand on the frame recalls Porky Pig at the end of a Looney Tunes cartoon, his hand on the circle as he pops into the frame for one last wave. The hand on the frame is a pointer to the space of the cartoon to come. The space of the cartoon, at its point of conception, always played with the cartoon being only ever about itself. In Duck Amuck, the cartoon space is revealed as exactly what it is when Daffy demands to see who the animator is who's been interfering with his backgrounds all along. The camera pulls back to reveal Bugs Bunny as the artist. Let's look at the text in Murillo's painting. Instead of reading, "That's all folks," the inscription reads, "Bartolome Murillo, portraying himself to fulfill the wishes and prayers of his children." This is a personal picture, not just a picture about pictures, although it is that too. A good picture can be both. Just as in Duck Amuck, through the formal experimentation of the cartoon as a space of pure representation, we learn a lot about Daffy's ambitions and the way he wants to be seen. We learn much of the same about Murillo in this painting. It's a painting about the artist and what he leaves behind. It is the artist as he saw himself, or wanted to be seen, and the painting was made to hang in the house of his children. Murillo's work often represented the space of childhood. His Baroque masterpieces, not the religious totemic paintings, but the street children of Seville, directly influenced the tradition of painting idealised childhood taken up by Gainsborough and Reynolds in the century to follow. These images set in motion a seismic change in the way childhood was thought of. This is my work that explores the legacy of those images on the idea of childhood through Victorian Britain into the modern imagination. I bought all these pictures from charity shops between 1999 and 2013. It was a physical image search, before the age of the Google image search. These were the images that adorned the walls of the average household. The change in the way we perceive childhood as innocent, idyllic, angelic, arguably filtered down to us through Murillo's representations. But once again, let's follow Murillo through the mirror, to the side Murillo is now on, almost. The side where representation can be unhooked from its referent. Murillo is over here with one hand left on the threshold of the other world. The permeability of the mirror's membrane foretells the moment in Alice Through the Looking Glass, and her world through the mirror which is unhooked from logic and physics, where representation can no longer correspond to the familiar world. This side of the glass is explored again when Mickey Mouse crosses through in Mickey Through the Looking Glass, and updated in this image that splices this moment with the moment of the red pill in the Matrix, which is the undoubtedly central and most overused metaphor of our age. The mirror is a point between one world and another. It is the portable whole of the cartoon.
I fooled you.
When one is thinking about what to leave behind, reflection will certainly be part of the process. Sylvia Plath understood this peculiar surface's ability to tell us something about ourselves. She writes from the position of the mirror, silver and exact. Now I am a lake. A woman bends over me, searching my reaches for what she really is. She turns to those liars, the candle or the moon. I see her back and reflect it faithfully. She rewards me with tears and an agitation of hands. I am important to her. She comes and goes. Each morning it is her face that replaces the darkness. In me she has drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises towards her day after day, like a terrible fish. This last line shows us the unstable relationship between the two sides of the mirror. Mirrors will always be magic. It cannot be trusted, but it will also tell the truth. We change in front of mirrors. They are how we see how we have changed. They are always a space of transition. Murillo's painting speaks to the present moment from the threshold of the frame between the two sides of the image, showing the solid frame between the two with a reassuring hand. It is, along with Parmigianino's convex mirror, one of the original mirror selfies. Today a phone screen's camera can be flipped to show the self and become a mirror. I remember the first time I saw someone use a phone as a mirror on a train to do their makeup. The mirror selfie is often a space of trickery. Murillo warns us with his picture about pictures not to trust it. If someone is seen holding their phone up, we presume this is the device that has captured its own image in a reflection. We are so sure of this, we don't stop to question it. But where are the smudges and smears? And why would there be a mirror there? Perhaps, as this influencer explained, there was no mirror, simply a second phone or a camera. The phone is simply a prop to make us believe the image that was casual was anything but. The phone, like the frame of the mirror, acts to frame the image. It also, like Las Meninas, shows us we are not where we think we are in relation to the picture. Like Murillo, it is about self-image. It tells us how the person wants to be perceived, the image they want to leave behind. What is Murillo telling his children in this painting? What is he leaving behind? If the only means for the artist to enforce the truth of fiction is by denying its fictitiousness, then I think Murillo is saying, despite the fact I am an artist, you can still trust me. So that was the first part of the talk. So let's step outside the frame for a moment. It's the premise of this series of talks to show why I've chosen the painting I have. I've done so because I'm often also inside my work, using an image of myself, often to look at the space of representation, more often to make clear the construct of the work, remind the viewer of the nature of its own construction, not the viewer's construction, the work's construction. That was slightly badly phrased. This is a clip from Laws of Motion in a Cartoon Landscape, in which a cartoon version of myself temporarily leaves the frame to examine the possibilities of breaking free from the space of the cartoon. The silhouette of passage is an indexical mark, left by the protagonist on the solid matter that is passing through at great speed or with excessive force. The shadow on the wall becomes a ripped-out cookie-cutter shape as the character leaves the frame. In the last clip, we see something particularly interesting. Gossamer the monster leaves an infinite silhouette of passage as he attempts to break out of the cartoon universe, which seems to expand forever in strata-like layers of colour. The curious factor here is the cause of this flight outwards, this attempt to break out of the cartoon landscape. Because for the entirety of the preceding cartoon, Bugs has been hounded by this monster, resulting in numerous ploys to avoid being caught, such as cross-dressing and hiding in suits of armour. However, after finally being captured, in a simple reflexive act, he points to the audience, reveals the mechanisms of the cartoon, and sends the monster into a panic that sees him run straight at the wall, leaving his infinite silhouette of passage. Bugs Bunny has the ability to oscillate between being seemingly unconscious and completely conscious of the laws of the cartoon landscape, choosing at crucial and opportune moments to simply flip between not knowing and knowing. This is not something all the characters can do. Self-consciousness here terrifies the monster, and it sees him attempt to smash out of his own labyrinth. And, in a moment recording the sublime landscape painting of Caspar David Friedrich, we see the cartoon landscape expand infinitely, each room inside another room, viewed in relation to the back of Bugs' head as he stares through the infinite rip in the fabric of the cartoon landscape. At other times, the cartoon landscape's membrane has been permeable.
Okay, you can explain. You can explain this one.
I'll now show you a tiny moment from Natural Selection, a film I made with my dad in 2017. It's a tiny detail, but an important one. In the film, my dad and I spend half an hour discussing how birds make birds' nests. My dad's an ornithologist, and he occupies the right-hand screen. I'm on the left, talking about the same subject, but with a different approach. The screens appear separate, but at one moment we pass a nest between screens, which shows that we are both in the same space and reveals the way the film has been made, with the two of us in separate but linked green screen booths.
It's the nest of the long-tailed tit. These are normally concealed in thick, prickly bushes, making them very hard to find. These nests are even more remarkable when you think that a long-tailed tit can make a nest like this in its first year, having never been shown how to do so.
And it does seem hard to believe when you look at how this is made.
In MIMS, Maximum Irony, Maximum Sincerity, 1999 to 2003, Towards a Unified Theory of MIMS, I cast a teenager to play me in a film about my adolescent attempt to start an art movement that called for an equal and maximum dose of irony and sincerity simultaneously in the making of art and in life in general. In the film, the teenager is a representation of my younger self acting in front of my old artworks and recreations of previous pieces, but at one moment the acting breaks down and you hear my voice talking to the actor who's playing me from behind the camera. It reminds you, yes, this is a film, this is how it's made, but this too was carefully scripted, not at all outside of the frame, but inside, just as Murillo's hand is. I've always been interested in being both inside and outside the frame, like Murillo in this painting, pushing and pulling the edge of the frame, expanding the edge of it to see what it can capture, playing with the form but not simply for formal ends. As with Murillo, the work, in its formal experimentation, despite being a picture about a picture, does not point inwards. And I think this is what Murillo is trying to show us. There will always be things the picture will speak of outside of itself. As the frame, the material frame, is not a hard border. Things will always spill out of the work, but will always escape the frame through the mind of the spectator, through the image in its immaterial form. Murillo was using this work to speak to his children, to show how he saw himself, always both in the world and looking out, and outside of the world, looking in.
That Andy. Are you there? Great. That was an incredible journey that we just went through, and all kind of, it was impressive because it was a sort of brief that we gave you from the start to think about choosing a painting in the National Gallery's collection and then being drawn to Murillo's self-portrait, and then also then taking us on this incredible journey through thinking about the ideas of how you might present yourself, but overstep that kind of boundary of that virtual plane into something else and then into your work, which is incredible. I'm going to kick off with a question, Andy, partly around this idea of the self-image and creating a self-portrait. So Murillo, there are only two known self-portraits of Murillo's, so the one in the National Gallery's collection and one at the Frick, which was an earlier self-portrait. But he made the one that's in London. He made that during, I think when he was in his 50s. And as you mentioned in the film, he dedicated this piece to his children. You know, the kind of the text at the bottom of the painting says, Bartolome Murillo portraying himself to fulfill the wishes and prayers of his children. And it's an interesting statement to make because there's this sense of responsibility and reflection on his own on his own legacy for his children, and actually perhaps to the sort of students that he's leaving behind in the art academy that he founded. But what I find interesting about this statement in particular, and this kind of gesture of producing this self-image, is that he's engaging with this dialogue across generations. And I think this is also something that you do in your work too. And you showed, just towards the end, those two clips of works from Natural Selection and from MIMS. In Natural Selection, you discuss the building of nests with your father, who's an ornithologist. And in MIMS, you hire these teenage actors to play younger versions of yourself and your friends. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you use that method or tool of putting yourself in the frame as this sort of virtual self in this kind of illusionary world or this other reality to help frame that intergenerational discussion, and perhaps also around talk about the tensions around that too, if that's okay.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
Sorry, big question to start off.
No, what a great question. Wow. That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult with that. I mean, each work has, I suppose, a slightly different specific remit. It's harder to sort of zoom out and say generally, so maybe I can sort of choose a specific amongst that. But the question of communicating intergenerationally is really interesting to me, because it is something I do a lot. There's a work one of my favorite early pieces is just a simple photograph of a sculpture I made for my grand's house. And it's a portrait of her sat in her house, and then my sculpture that I made and her sitting next to it. And it's a sort of, again, actually, it's a kind of sort of using sculpture as a kind of rupture in time. Certainly making these little connections through time, I get, is part of it. It's an idea of, I suppose, my fascination with art as a way of portraying non-linear time is one of the more reoccurring elements. MIMS certainly does this. It came from a starting point of getting, I mean, I had a funny journey anyway, because I think in some ways, a lot of my life has been pretty continuous, or it feels like it has, so I lived with my dad from age about 24 to 30 something. And in the same house, in the same bedroom that I grew up in. So I kind of ended up living back in my childhood bedroom for a very long time. And so these sort of loops in time became interesting to me because they became quite physical. I remember, and it came from actually a place, I remember going out the door one morning, having this overwhelming feeling that I could have got on the bus to go to school, or I could have gone down the road to see a friend who no longer lived there, or I could have been due to go to university. Like, I had this sudden image that all these different versions were sort of still happening simultaneously, and that I could just dip back in. I could actually, if I sort of tried hard enough, if I recreated all the kind of methodical parameters of the environment, maybe I could sort of. So a lot of my work is what I describe as almost like an emotional or temporal experiment. So like with MIMS, I rebuilt all the elements of this period of my adolescence, and then cast teenagers to play me and my friends. And then they recreated our exact conversations. Well, the way we did that was by meeting up and talking about what we thought we talked about, and then changing the tense to make it present. So there's this, there was this sense that then you could drop back in and ask questions about how the past informed the way that you were making sense of the present. There was this feeling for me that to understand our own interpretive frameworks, we have to understand the kind of how they became formed, and trying to examine these sort of formative moments where a lot of your the way that you come to see the world has been shaped by a set of circumstances and sometimes you can access those. So what I often try and do is almost drop back into those moments and sort of almost build them so you can explore them from perspectives that you could not previously occupy. And the idea that you can only know your own story from this one internalized perspective is something that's always fascinating to me. I'm often looking to find these other perspectives, to say, well, actually, you can never tell the story of yourself without incorporating these other perspectives. So it is, for me, that's often the experiment at the heart of some of it. And cartoons were then an obvious metaphor to allow me to explore that through formal means, because they do that so brilliantly. Bugs Bunny can exist in any point of time simultaneously, and can flip between being a he or a she, can be in, can pop up in Rome, can pop up in the Wild West, can pop up in space without any. There's this sort of weird fluidity, and the reason sort of laws of motion was, well, that's because our whole concept of theoretical physics around the time that cartoons had changed in this theoretical space of the cartoon was reflecting a theoretical premise of actually a non-linear nature of time. So there's definitely, that's one reason. And then there is definitely an emotional agenda, which is, say, it's still about, like Murillo, understanding your own space within the world in some ways, and that as an emotional register, and using it as a space to communicate in a really quite sincere and traditional way, I suppose, to look at the kind of and for me, this talking through generations to involving my dad or my gran or younger version of myself is a way of doing that. Actually, you can actually access quite a strange space of that emotional gap that opens up between family members, between friends that are parted through distance. So for me, art's an amazing space to do that, because it allows a simultaneity. It allows kind of everything to be laid out in one space, and so actually you can play with this notion of time.
And I also wonder if it's to do with sort of framing something in a certain way as well. So this idea of creating some sort of virtual distance, you know, this fourth wall, as it were, or breaking that fourth wall, and allowing the cartoons, you know, to sort of transform a certain situation into something else, you know. I've got another question, but actually it's sort of connected to a question that's come in from Kate Clark. And Kate's asked, so she said, I've loved the ideas explored by Andy in the film. In terms of meta picturing in art and film, the suggestion was that it occurs at specific, in brackets, crisis points in time for the art form. Can you say a little bit more about that? And perhaps also, I was going to ask a question about laws of motion and how that series of works, and you kind of described this film as being in a sort of bonus chapter to that series, sort of explores that as well, explores the kind of idea of these cartoon laws and how they might reflect in our sort of contemporary society as well.
Yeah, I think that was the big discovery for me, actually, in putting together and reading about Murillo and the emergence of the Baroque. And I hadn't really read that history on and the phrase meta picture was one that came out of a number of essays about sort of late, that's the split between kind of late medieval painting and kind of emergence of something else that happens after the Renaissance. And it was interesting to me, because I thought about it deeply in terms of cartoons and the early 20th century and changes in representation, how cartoons could be a response to that, even if often our brains need a response to seismic shifts, which can be, I'd say Buster Keaton would be the other example in that period in a way. And I think this film, I would be like this, I think I was really thinking about that when I was like, well, what if, with this lecture, actually, I was like, what if you did an art history lecture with kind of more indebted to Buster Keaton than you did to, I don't know, to TJ Clark or something. And this idea that it appears at certain points of crisis, I thought that was interesting. And it's something I'd like to map a little bit more in terms of, the change in status of what pictures were for and who they were for and material conditions is massive. And what I found was fascinating, I didn't have space to put it in, but there's this definition that came out with Murillo when people, which was a reference to his work as fancy pictures, which as like almost emerged as a new category. It's like, the hell's a fancy picture? It's like, well, it's not an all religious altarpiece, and it's not a painting of a patron. It's kind of this. So actually, this sort of happened because a lot of new money emerged in a sort of the merchant class, and there was a demand for another kind of painting, and another type of audience emerged for art that was not religious, for example, or not for. So there is moments when the status of art and who it's for, what it's for, starts to change. And I would say we're definitely in one of those moments again in a kind of dramatic and quite exciting way. And maybe I'll just keep on saying that because you can never kind of not be wrong. But it definitely, I mean, because I say, I've definitely, and again, then making these little links through time and going, oh, it's funny that this happens. I mean, my favorite discovery was sort of the Porky Pig on the edge of the Looney Tunes, the hand on the circle in Murillo. It's like so similar. Maybe there is something in this. What is it that moment of really playing with the material construction of the work as a subject point, and why do they emerge at certain points of time? I can't fully answer it other than to say I do think the changes in material conditions of the status of imagery and the role that it will play in society and who is in control of it would be one of the very large factors. Probably can't go into that too much with the kind of moment right now in terms of digital images and the kind of the huge changes that were happening even in the last month. But I think, there's something in, and I hadn't had time to look at it probably. There's something in a lot of the early NFTs I've been looking at in the last few weeks. I don't want to turn this into talk about NFTs, but they are so many of them are just self-referential pictures because no one quite knows what to make, but they are pictures of people holding an Ethereum coin or a meta picture about most of the stuff is kind of referential to when the conditions of its own making, which is kind of interesting. It will kind of disappear again. But there's something in that early moments of huge changes in visibility that requires a excavation of that present of the conditions of picture making.
And actually that leads on to two questions that I can sort of connect, talking about this current moment where actually we're all kind of working at a distance from one another. So the first one is from Tabitha, who asks, what do you think the cartoon body, a body with an ability to move in ways that the human body cannot, and the represented image body can tell us about the present state of the physical human body and the situations it finds itself in today, i.e. sat in front of a computer, attached to hands and eyes that are engaged with screens of images. And then attached to that is a question that's come from Richard Wentworth. Could you say something about the craft constraints of making something remotely, which feels so very haptic?
It's funny because, like you say, Laws of Motion was this metaphor that I set up for 2016. A shift in the way that, into what, and I was like, let's come up with a fanciful phrase for describing the current moment. Let's call it the cartoon landscape. And I thought then, as the exhibition that you saw in reference at the beginning, structure of feeling, was me putting a kind of end to that metaphor, actually, temporarily, by talking about return to the body, a kind of, as a sort of central reclining figure, kind of carved, dead avatar in the center of it. That sounds clumsy, but it probably was clumsy. But then actually it was a sort of more of a radical splitting of the image away from the body. But I haven't, the show is called The Structure of Feeling because it was a way of saying something's changed on a structural level, but it's, at the moment, it's only a feeling. It's hard to be able to turn that into language. So therefore the title remains The Structure of Feeling, which is sort of so it's an unidentified shift in the landscape. So for me, the metaphor of the cartoon I felt was kind of ending with COVID, actually, because it was this sort of return to the body, a return to the local. My whole world now is like the same world it was as when I was a kid. Like my parameters are like 1 mile that way and 1 mile that way, actually. And I know this circle like I did when I was a child, when your world was only a certain shape and it was all about the body. And I said, that's kind of a fascinating shift from where I was a few years ago, where with Laws of Motion, I was in Dubai 1 week and Malta the next week, and then Toronto the next week. But that was an extreme version of it by all means, but it was a sense of this split, the digital and the body running at like hyper speed. Everything was moving at such an incredible speed. And so this slowing down felt like a new chapter. So, but to say how to make sense of it with this screen-based communication, it means that the metaphor isn't completely finished. There's something in that, the floating eyeball looking in through somebody else's screen. And Richard's question about kind of, I feel like I should then just pull the camera back round to show you the absolute chaos behind, or something like the actual backstage of sort of, but you can't see quite as far as there you go. There's the analog. It's my coffee falling over. Through that side, there's a very ad hoc green screen booth with sort of poles and a sheet hung up, and it's incredibly low tech. It's sort of it was like me yesterday trying to sort of stay up all night and just speak it, like recording the monologue and trying to mime along to myself in a sort of in a very you can't escape it. You know, you trip over the cables and the green screen fell down a number of times. And then, yeah, so there is always a physical backstage. And that's the thing that's kind of interesting to dwell on. And you get, and at the moment, I think we're particularly reminded of that.
And I think that was really, that's really interesting to hear you talk about that, because it very much felt like that going through the exhibition last year at Block 336, where you had this installation and actually you sort of adapted it for COVID sort of precautions. So the numbers of visitors in the space at one time were restricted, but actually we were all given a sort of go-kart to ride around within this barren cartoon landscape, this ghostly sort of fairground. And it felt really interesting kind of having sort of seen your films and seen your kind of avatar, your cartoon avatar, navigate these landscapes, but then suddenly we find ourselves within that too. So this is kind of, I guess, an expounding, or kind of this sun, faced with kind of this kind of fictive reality, fictive yet real worlds that we're kind of sort of trying to explore with you, in a sense. I was going to, there's another question, but perhaps it's quite actually really big in terms of its question that's come from Lauren about where do you place symbolism and imagination in the space between illusion, the virtual reality, and actuality? And I mean, that's a huge question, but I wondered if you had a sort of a response to that, or just an immediate thought to kind of respond to that question.
Wow, no, I mean, that's a PhD that I'm never going to write.
Yeah.
So, but it's kind of brilliant. I mean,
right?
Sorry?
That's probably what you're exploring through these films and through these works.
I mean, I was interested even at the beginning when you described laws of motion as an allegory. I was like, is it an allegory? Maybe that is the best word for it. But I never thought about it as an allegory. But I remembered that Michael Fried essay from way back in modernism talking about the allegorical, and always being interested in that phrase, that thinking. But I mean, maybe it's true. It's using one thing to think through another, but it isn't that straightforward. I mean, they're not fully allegorical. I mean, they are also what they are. Sorry, interesting. My neighbours are shouting over the fence really loudly in the background, which is definitely the interruption of the animal. I don't know if you could, which completely drew me away from my, bounced me back into the real world.
So I've got a question to sort of semi-round things up a little bit, but also looking to the future. Somebody noticed, Danny Pearson noticed that in the background, he couldn't help notice, but the stack of Beano annuals behind you in your studio. Are you a member of Dennis and the Dennis and Nasha fan club? But also, would you be able to talk about your future projects coming up this year, particularly about the project in Somerset House?
I think that's a nice thing to do. Thanks, Danny. It was like, I mean, that's. In any way, my focus, if laws of motion was about the descriptive laws of nature and the physical world, and kind of take that as time and space, or and the sort of Newtonian world. Actually, what I'm working on at the moment is using the Beano as a lens to explore the other aspect of the cartoon world, which is where my head is more in the world of morals and ethics. It's something that laws of motion doesn't explore, actually. In fact, the worst chapter in that film is when it talks about violence in cartoons, and it doesn't really know quite what to make of it, actually. The idea of the violence of the cartoon spilling out into the real world. I mean, it talks about Trump and it talks about various things, but it does not, it's quite unsatisfying, and it has to use a joke to get out of its fact that it doesn't know what to say about it in that space of, but actually the Beano is interesting to me because it's a cartoon world, again, that has its own logic and parameters, but it explores what we can get away with, where the rules are of our social interactions. And actually, if anything, for me, that's been what I've been kind of working on for the last year or so, to make a show at Somerset House next year. It explores this with the Beano. And that, for me, was the thing that maybe why I sounded kind of fluffy on the questions about sort of where we are with in laws of motion in relation to the COVID era. I've been totally much more thinking about through this, this lens of morals and ethics. And because so much of the moment is about rules, whether we change it again on Monday, we change the rules. It's something like 69 times in the last year we have changed the rules of interaction, that as in a way that has been dictated and prescribed. It's a kind of fascinating and even today I grabbed I'm always grabbing little kind of tweets and images, and someone posted an image of Boris Johnson and called it a moral black hole. And I was like, see, again, our lens has changed. The idea of the kind of the absence, the moral, the lack of, the idea that you just ad hoc change based on something, there's no kind of morality at the center. So I've been really trying to think that through in relation to the sensibility of comics. And the Beano is brilliant at this because it's, you read it at the age of when you're moving from childhood to adolescence, and these arbitrary nature of rules come down, which is, no, you can't do that, or you have to be home by 5 and you can't touch that. You're like, what, who works out those parameters? So for me, actually, that's where my kind of energies have been put a little bit, is to try and work that out, and whether the cartoon metaphor can help us think about the space of the social, moral, ethical rules of interaction. So that's what's in there in 50 years of Beano annuals. Hopefully the answer is in there somewhere.
And just leading on from that, so could you talk about what you're working on at the moment towards the project at Somerset House, and also the future shows that you're going to be in? Where can we see you, Andy? That's the question.
There's one moment where Laws of Motion is going to break fully out of the screen, and if you keep your eyes look up towards the rooftops in South London in early May, and you might get a glimpse of the kind of the cartoon world slipping into the real world in the Peckham area. So it's a very old idea that I see, not just with just not within the work, but within my work itself. I circle around a lot of different motifs that things come back, and it's probably the first idea I ever had, and but the first time I get to maybe do it properly. So making a sort of public sculpture in South London in May with bold tendencies, and so that'll be that's what I'm directly doing in a physical way at the moment. And the Beano are keeping me physically, keeping me awake at night.
So I just a final thought to kind of end the discussion and sort of bring it back to Murillo in a way. So I think it's interesting that we were drawn to the self-portrait by Murillo because of his hand, really, his right hand resting over the edge of that frame. And of course, that's sort of interpreted as his artist's hand, possibly the hand that he had worked with. And it's the kind of element that really drew us to kind of have this discussion for this evening's event. And I thought that perhaps this is the sort of connection with your work, that actually Murillo's hand is the sort of conceit of the way that you think about self-image and the way that you kind of break through virtuality. And actually your artistic hand could be that play of the reality of looking outwards and self-reflecting at the same time. So I want to say thank you so much for producing this amazing film and for sharing it with us today, and for sharing your work with us today. It's been brilliant. So thank you, Andy. And thank you once again to everybody for joining us at home. If you enjoyed this evening's talk, please do check out more of our Unexpected View talks on our YouTube channel, and keep an eye out on the National Gallery's website for future events. So thank you everyone once again, and have a good evening. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.